Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order. It's 6:30 and ask the clerk to conduct the roll call, please.
Thank you. Acting Chair Height. Councillor Bateman.
Present.
Councillor Campion. Councillor Kiokio.
Present.
Councillor Crater.
Present.
Councillor Easton. Present. Councillor Foster.
Present.
Councillor Ganan. Councillor Grant. Councillor Greenwood.
Present.
Councillor Encina.
Here.
Councillor Yip. Councillor Jordan.
I'm here.
Councillor Junkin. Councillor Kaiser.
Present.
Councillor Morocco.
Present.
Councillor Olson.
Present.
Councillor Rigby.
Present.
Councillor Seaborn.
Present.
Councillor Secord. Councillor Cisco. Councillor Sorrento.
In the House, clerk.
Councillor Valella.
Present.
Councillor Whalen.
Present.
Councillor Witteveen.
Present.
Councillor Zalepa.
I'm here, thank you.
And we have regrets tonight from Councillors Badaway, Diodati, Redicott, Steele, and Ugalini, Chair.
Thank you. I'll call on Councillor Foster to read the land acknowledgement statement, please.
Yes, thank you, Acting Chair. Niagara Region is situated on treaty land. This land is steeped in the rich history of the First Nations, such as the Haudenosaunee, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. There are many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit from across Turtle Island that live and work in Niagara today. The regional municipality of Niagara stands with all Indigenous peoples, past and present, in promoting the wise stewardship of the lands on which we live.
Thank you. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest tonight? Seeing none, on 4.1, today's presentation, I'll call on Daryl Abs, Managing Partner of Watson and Associates, for the presentation respecting development charge overview and background study. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Acting Chair, members of Council. Pleasure to be here this evening. So, as stated, my name is Daryl Abs, Managing Partner with Watson & Associates Economists Limited, and we're working with Region staff right now in preparing the development charges background study. And so this presentation is really the first presentation to Council to provide you with an update excuse me, on what we're doing with the process, the timelines of the process, and some of the recent legislative changes that we'll be dealing with and navigating throughout this background study. And so I'll first talk a little bit about development charges. What are they? Why do municipalities use these? Use this revenue tool? And we'll talk a little bit about some other revenue tools. We'll talk about the recent changes to the Act. There's been quite a few changes over the last few years, so I'll do my best to summarize those changes based on what's pertinent. We'll talk about some emerging issues with development charges. Development charges are in the news now more than they have ever been, and so we'll talk a little bit about what we see with development charges, and then as well some of the development charge issues that you've been dealing with over the last few years and how we're going to address those through the bylaw process. We'll talk about the development charge study, where we're at in the study, what the anticipated process is and those timelines, and then we'll briefly touch on the development charge reduction program and some of the intent behind that, and then happy to answer any questions that you might have. So development charges are a revenue tool used by municipalities to recover the capital costs associated with development. We have new homes, new businesses coming to the region. Because of that development, we need to invest in infrastructure. We want to recover the capital cost of that infrastructure from that new development. And this is kind of where the idea of growth pays for growth comes in. When we do these studies, historically, when we talk about growth pays for growth, prior to a lot of the legislative changes, development charges paid for about 70-75% of the growth-related costs. Now, with a lot of the changes, likely less. But nevertheless, the intent behind this revenue tool is to recover the capital cost, or as much as we can, recover the growth-related share of the capital costs from new development. And so these costs are in addition to what a developer would normally pay for as part of their subdivision development. So think of a typical subdivision in your municipality. Inside that subdivision, you have the internal roads, the water mains, the sewer mains. The developer typically pays for that. The development charges are to recover the cost for the capital that connects those developments together, the broader infrastructure, and in your case, the broader regional infrastructure. The Development Charges Act is what gives municipalities the authority to impose charges, and it also guides us in the preparation of the background study, the calculations, the interpretation of the bylaw, the application of the bylaw, and all of those matters. And so that's what we're following in the preparation of the analysis. So there's only a few revenue tools that municipalities have to finance growth and growth-related costs. And so at the regional level, we're looking at development charges. And so we'll get into some of the eligible services, but it really applies to all development and redevelopment, save and except for what's exempt, which again, we'll talk about. The other revenue tools are utilized at the local municipal level. So community benefit charges can be imposed by lower tier municipalities, not upper tier municipalities, so lower tier and single tier. And it's really a charge on high density development to recover the capital costs associated with that high density. If you have 5 stories or more and 10 residential units or more, you could be subject to a community benefit charge if you pass the bylaw. Parkland dedication is something all the lower tier municipalities would be imposing, and so you can either get the land to build a park on, or you can get cash in lieu of the land so that you can go purchase land to build a park. Okay, so at the regional level, we're really only looking at development charges. So where do they fit into the broader financial picture? And so one of the things we want to consider is that when we have development, there's an impact on the budget, and we can kind of estimate what that impact is going to be on the tax-supported budget and the rate-supported budget. So on the top left, what we identify in the schematic is the proposed developing land area. And so we can think of this as a subdivision, a secondary plan, your local municipality, or even broadly at the regional level. So we can look at the developing land area and we can identify what the anticipated population and housing related to that population and the employees, the jobs, and the square footage of that businesses that would be constructed to accommodate those employees. So with that, if we look at the top orange box, we're going to get new assessment, new tax revenue. And that's something we all know, and that's something we hear from the development community. We're going to build, we're going to get tax revenue. And that's true. You're going to get new tax revenue. You'll also get new non-tax revenue, fees, fines, fares, some of those other revenues that you have on the books. You'll also get water and wastewater revenues too. And so that's the revenue side up in the orange. If we jump down to the bottom, it says identification of infrastructure requirements. And this is usually the big cost. So we have infrastructure we need to accommodate that development. And so with that infrastructure comes operating costs. So you have operating costs if you're going to build a new road, if you're going to build or expand a treatment plant, you're going to build a new pipe, that comes with additional operating costs. You also have operating costs for all those other services, administration, planning, et cetera, that can also be estimated. In addition to that, you have the life cycle replacement cost. Once these assets are constructed, you might fund them with development charges, or the developer might build them, pay for them, and then you'll assume them. But that becomes a liability in your books. Now you have to start to plan to replace that asset. Just like when you were going through your asset management planning over the last few years, the Infrastructure for Jobs and Prosperity Act requires you to financially plan for these things. So that should also be accounted for in this impact of development. Development charges are really just one small component of this whole financial picture, and that is how we're going to finance the initial infrastructure. So just the initial infrastructure. Once you pay for that, then you have to deal with the replacement, right? And so if we take all those revenues, we take those additional life cycle costs, the additional operating costs, put them all together, we can figure out what the impact is on the taxpayer, ratepayer. Again, development charges just play one small part in the broader financial picture. So with development charges, the Development Charges Act has been amended now, and it does identify the 19 eligible services that you can impose a development charge for. Okay, I won't read them all to you, but generally the highest ones are water, wastewater, services related to a highway, which is really roads and public works, transit, And then at the lower tier level, Parks and Recreation is usually one of the higher ones. But again, it provides for 19 eligible services in the Act. Now, we can include development charges related to each of these services, or we can combine or separate these services into different classes of service. That's what allows us to incorporate a charge for growth-related studies, for example, because they relate to all these services. So again, as we go through and we put together the development charge background study analysis, we'll be bringing forward more details on what services specifically we'll be looking at, generally carrying forward the services we had in the previous study. But again, we'll have more of a chance to talk about that. So with development charges, what can we use them to pay for? And so the Development Charges Act clearly has a definition of what's an eligible capital cost. So we can acquire land or an interest in land. We can improve the land, so you think landscaping and walkways, pathways, those kind of things. We can acquire, lease, construct, or improve buildings, facilities, or structures, which includes the furniture, fixtures, and equipment within those structures. Equipment and rolling stock, which is really, think about your public works pickup trucks and the graders and mowers, et cetera, the larger order capital. And then if we're going to lease any facilities or vehicles, we can also include the capital component thereof. Circulation materials for libraries are defined in the Act. And then as well, cost to undertake studies in connection with the above. So if we have growth-related studies that relate to those eligible services, we can incorporate that into the study. And then the DC background study itself gets funded with development charges. Okay? If you need to issue debt to pay for any of these items that we include in the background study, we can include the interest costs, and that interest cost can be funded with development charges as well. Now, the Act specifically identifies things we cannot include. So parkland acquisition. Remember, because we talked about those previous growth-related financing tools, lower tier municipalities will get parkland through parkland dedication through the Planning Act, so we're not allowed to use development charges to purchase parkland. Vehicles and equipment have to have a life, average useful life of about 7 years or more to ensure that we're not including everything like hammers, nails, etc. We're including larger order capital costs. And then computer equipment that's not integral to providing the service. The legislation was written in 1997. Computers played a far different role than they do today in our life. So things like SCADA systems or computer systems to run the water wastewater plant, those are integral to providing the service. We can include those. Laptops in a police cruiser is integral. The laptops that council might have or staff, let's say administrative staff, those wouldn't be eligible for DCs. When we look at the background study and we start to plan for the capital needs, we can use any planning horizon for pretty much every service, except for transit, we're limited to 10 years, and now land, there's some restrictions as well. But generally, we can use any time horizon. So what we tend to do is we align whatever master plan has been undertaken. So I know your ongoing water, wastewater, master servicing plan, transportation plan, we'll have a planning forecast, and we'll plan to that same forecast so that the capital needs align with the growth that we're planning for. And so when we undertake the development charge calculation, I know there's a lot of spreadsheets involved in the calculations and a lot of tables in the background study, but we can boil it down to this. The first thing we need to do is identify the anticipated development, so the amount, type, and location of development. Then from there, we can identify the increase in need for service arising from that development, and then identify all those specific capital projects needed to meet that need to accommodate the development. Once we have those costs, we need to make a series of deductions because not all of those costs are going to be related to the new development. So any share of the costs that benefit the existing community, for example, if we're going to take, let's say, a building, knock it down and build a bigger building, we need to take into account that we're replacing something that was already there. And so we can't fund development charges, use development charges to fund that replacement of the existing building, just the expansion. As well, we make a deduction for any share of the cost that benefit growth outside of our forecast period. So for example, if our forecast period's to 2051, but we're going to oversize a water treatment plant, for example, to accommodate growth to 2060, we need to make a deduction for the growth between 2051 and 2060 because it's not in our denominator in our calculations. So there's some deductions we make there. And then if there's any grants, subsidies, or other contributions that we know for sure we're getting, we will also deduct them from the calculations. What we're left with is the growth-related costs, the DC net capital costs. We divide that by the growth, residential and non-residential growth, to get a development charge per unit for residential and a development charge per square foot or per square meter of floor space for non-residential development. So when are development charges typically paid? Now, when we did the background study back in 2022 and even back in 2017, this slide would have been 1 or 2 bullets that said you pay at the time of building permit. Now, with a lot of the legislative changes that have occurred, it varies significantly, and there's a lot of administration that goes along with it. So typical residential development would be calculated at building permit. So we'd calculate the development charge at the time of building permit, but they wouldn't pay until occupancy. Okay? And so municipalities now, to deal with this, have the ability to require occupancy permits from developers so that they have to come in to get their occupancy permit, they pay their DC, and then they can get occupancy. Rental housing, they get a discount based on the number of bedrooms in the unit, and they get to pay their development charge in installments. So the first installment at occupancy, and then each year for the next 5 years, they pay equal installments. Nonprofit housing is exempt. Affordable housing is exempt, where it meets the definition of the affordable unit price in your respective municipality, and also have to enter into an agreement to ensure that it remains affordable for 25 years. Attainable units are exempt. We just don't have a definition of what attainable means yet. As I understand, the province is working on that. So once that comes out, that would be incorporated into the bylaw. Non-residential development, so commercial development would generally pay at the time of building permit. Institutional development would pay in installments just like rental housing. Industrial development, they pay at the time of building permit, but they also get to expand their industrial footprint up to 50%, and they don't have to pay development charges on that first 50%. Universities are exempt. Colleges are also exempt to the extent that they're crown corporations, they would be exempt. Upper tier, lower tier governments don't pay development charges, and they don't. The school boards don't pay development charges either. Nonprofit retirement homes and long-term care homes are also now exempt. There's also, if I proceed as a developer through site plan or zoning bylaw amendment application, my rate is frozen at the time I submit my complete application. The municipality will go through, review that application. Once that application is approved, I then have 18 months to pull my building permit, and I get to utilize that frozen rate from when I submitted my application. So lots of administration around that. So development charges aren't new. They've been around since the 50s. They were called lot levies, and they were imposed under the Planning Act, all the way up until 1989 when the first Development Charges Act was created. In 1997, there was a number of changes, restrictions, reductions to the Development Charges Act, and Development Charges Act 1997 is what we used pretty much all the way up until 2019. As you can see on the right-hand side, there's a number of changes that have occurred, most since 2019, but 12 in total since 2016. And so I mentioned I won't go through all of the gory details of all of the changes, but what I've done is broken this down into some minor changes and major changes. So the more minor changes was Bill 73 brought in this forward-looking service standard for transit that we incorporate into the calculations, and brought in this elongated 60-day engagement process. So once we release the background study to the public, put it on the website, we have to wait 60 days before we can pass a bylaw. In 2020, brought in the university's exemption. 2022 brought in some additional reporting requirements for the annual treasurer statement. Bill 134 in 2023 refined some of the definitions of affordable housing and what criteria would meet that definition. And then the most recent change, Bill 98, brought in an exemption for nonprofit retirement homes. So the more major changes happened, again, kind of throughout. So 2019, we were introduced to the rate freeze and the installment payment provisions, which created some administrative burden for municipalities. In 2020, Bill 197 brought in community benefit charges, listed the eligible services in the Development Charges Act, and then it also removed this 10% deduction we used to have to do. So for all services except water, wastewater, roads, police, fire, storm, we used to have to calculate the growth-related share, and then we used to have to also take 10% of that off and fund that through non-DC sources. That was removed back in 2020. Bill 23, I'm sure everyone's familiar with Bill 23. That came out in 2022, brought in a number of exemptions, reductions, removed housing as an eligible service. So you used to be able to impose development charges for housing services. Now you can't. And it also elongated the life of the development charge bylaw to 10 years. So previously it used to expire every 5 years. Now it can have a life of 10 years. In 2024, there was some basically the province heard from municipalities and walked back some of the changes they put in with Bill 23. And then the more recent changes in 2025 brought in an exemption for long-term care homes. One of the big changes is they moved the definition of capital cost to the regulations. And so that kind of seems benign, like it's not that big of a deal. But what that does is allow the province to not have to go through the whole amendment process, introduce a bill, pass it, and get royal assent. Now they can just put a posting in the Gazette and change the regulations. So they can change the definition of capital cost essentially tomorrow if they wanted, which provides for a little bit of uncertainty if they were to start changing that. There's a simplified bylaw amendment process, and this one I think is positive for municipalities. And so if you're going to extend the expiry date to align with the 10 years, if you're going to index the development or remove the indexing from the development charge bylaw, or if you're going to reduce the amount of the charge in whole or in part for different category or class of development, then you can go through this simplified bylaw amendment process. So the normal process is we do the analysis and work, we prepare a background study, we put that study on the website, we wait about a month, we have a public meeting, we wait another month, so the 60 days, we pass the bylaw, then there's a 40-day period for appeals. This simplified process allows us to just pass the bylaw, provide notice, and that's it. No appeals, it's just passed and implemented. Okay, so that is one thing for municipalities that actually cut some of the administration. The residential deferral of DCs to occupancy, I mentioned that that's the case, and that was instituted back in 2025, so just last year. Removal of interest rates for installment payments. So those institutional and rental housing would pay in installments. We used to be able to provide interest, put interest on that. Now we can't. And then I'll talk about the grouping of services for credits under Bill 60. And then the allocation of 60% of the balance in the reserve funds. So previously we only had to do that for water, wastewater, roads. Now we have to do that for all services. So as part of the annual treasurer statement, what will be included in that is an identification of how we're going to allocate those balances. We don't have to spend the money every year. We just have to allocate it to projects. I'm sure one of the things you've heard from the province is that municipalities are sitting on piles and piles of cash in their reserves and reserve funds. And so I think one of the things to address this was really to provide some transparency on how you're going to be spending that money, right? We know facilities are very expensive, so you might be saving up to spend on a facility. Now it can be identified and transparent in the annual treasurer statement. And then lastly, there's the addition of a new index for the purposes of indexing the bylaw, the London Index. So Bill 60 came in then right at the end of the year. And what it did was provided for this additional class of service for land. So this is going to have an impact on the calculations of the region's bylaw. But what we have to do is we have to create a new category for land. So it'll be its own calculation, its own charge, and we'll have to separate that from the other components of the service. Previously, it was just wrapped in with roads and water and wastewater. Now we have to separate it. One of the things we have to do as part of the background study for all services except for water, wastewater, and transit is we have to look at this historical level of service. So what we do is we take a look at the last 15 years. We identify the assets that you had in that category, and we put a replacement value to those assets. And what we can do is calculate the average level of service that you provided over that last 15 years. We used to be able to include land in the facility costs and in the cost of the assets. Now we can no longer do that. So that might have an impact on what we can actually include in the development charge. But we'll know more as we get through the analysis. Merging of credits for water, wastewater. And so credits are, if there's a project in your development charge background study, and I'm a developer, and let's say there's a water main that the municipality is going to build in 2030. But I'm a developer, and I don't want to wait till 2030. I want to build that now. So I say, I'm going to build it on your behalf. You just give me a credit against my development charge. Every time I go pull a building permit, I don't pay the water development charge, let's say, until I basically get all my money back for the water pipe that I built on your behalf. What they've done is they merge water and wastewater together. So generally, it shouldn't be too much of an issue for some municipalities, but it can create some cash flow issues if you do have a lot of these credit agreements. And let's say, a lot of these credit agreements relate to water, but then you're not collecting DCs for wastewater. It could create some cash flow issues. So again, something we'll speak to more as part of the background study if there is an impact potentially. There's additional detail required in the background studies. So if you read the background study you currently have and you thought, this study is not long enough, let's put more information into that study. We have to add a new section that really gets into detail about the non-growth related costs. So again, just a little bit more information. Further reporting requirements for the treasurer's statement and the requirement to have the treasurer's statement completed by June 30th and submitted to the minister by July 15th. So previously these were not submitted to the ministry, but now they want them to be submitted, presuming that they want to start reviewing these and seeing how municipalities are allocating those reserve fund balances. Okay, and then there's a requirement for a local service policy. So within your background study, we already have a local service policy. We've had it for a number of years. Our firm's position was that we kind of needed this anyways, even before this legislation came out. But what this is really, if I'm a developer and I look at the background study, I look at the local service policy, it's clear what's the developer's responsibility versus what the municipality is going to include and fund with development charges. Okay, this is just an example to show you how it might work. So for example, let's say water supply and treatment and major pumping stations and water mains external to subdivisions would be funded with development charges, but those water mains internal to the subdivision, maybe water mains that are only required for one development, those would be a direct developer cost. Okay, we're going to go through and review your local service policy just to make sure that aligns with the updated guidelines from the legislation. But in the initial review, it looks like it generally aligns already. So there's been some emerging issues with DCs, and we know that they're in the news given some of the major increases that have been identified over the number of years. But one thing to keep in mind is development charges are to recover the capital costs associated with development. Right? Development comes to the region, comes to your municipality. You need to build infrastructure to accommodate them. If the cost of that infrastructure goes up, it makes sense that the DCs go up as well. Right? And so what we've seen and what we've observed by working with municipalities ever since COVID, the global uncertainty, and other economic factors, the tender prices for municipal projects have increased significantly, and that puts upward pressure on development charges. Okay? We've seen home builders associations, realtors associations, and other groups put out studies and surveys. Generally, the message is to lower development charges. Okay? So, and I apologize, it's probably a bit small on the screen, but what we've done is we've kind of just taken the regional municipalities, we've looked at Waterloo municipalities, City of Hamilton, Halton region municipalities, and we've included Toronto as well, and Peel region municipalities, just to give you a sense of what the development charges are across those areas. And the numbers in the red are the regional municipalities. So you can see you kind of range from the lower to the middle of that survey based on your current rates today. One thing that's important to note is when we look at Peel and Halton region, the upper tier charge is in the blue and the lower tier is in the green. And we see the upper tier is a big component of the charge. And that's because those municipalities have full responsibility for water and wastewater infrastructure, which tends to be the highest component of any charges. And so in Niagara, it's a bit unique where you have kind of, you have the major supply and treatment of water, the major trunk infrastructure, with some lower tiers having the responsibility of the more localized pipes and collection. So you see your blue number is probably a different share. But generally, you can see, based on the current rates, you're kind of low, middle of the forecast, or of the survey, sorry. And so what does that actually mean, and how do development charges compare to home prices? And so what we did is I took a look, historically over the last, let's say 20 years, development charges have been on average about 6 to 8% of the price of a home, right? Looking at single detached homes. And so when we take a look, and all I did was go on livable.com, it's a publicly available information on new home prices. And if I compare that to what the development charges are, in my hometown of Lincoln, we have a range of about 6.8% to about 8.85%. At Niagara Falls, it's about 4.6 to 6.7%. And the one development in St. Catharines is about 6.25%. So again, still within that range of what we've seen historically where development charges have landed. Now, one of the big challenges is, development charges are one component of the overall cost. And if we took a look at a development pro forma, on the right side, we have project revenues. So I'm going to build my units, I'm going to sell them, and the revenues are what I can sell my units for. On the left side are all the costs that go into that. So the developer's profit margin. Now, it's important to note that when most developers don't have millions and millions of dollars sitting in the bank account, they're generally going to finance the project. So they're going to go to the bank and they're going to get a loan. They need to show the bank a profit margin of about 12 to 15%, which is, based on the pro forma. At the end of the project, it might be less than 12 to 15%, but they need to show the bank, based on the beginning of the pro forma, they should be getting about 12 to 15%. Otherwise, they can't get the financing. One of the other things is, so we have construction-related costs, and that's what we've seen increase significantly. We've seen it in your own municipal tenders, but we've also seen it on the developer's side in their construction-related cost. And when we've run some of these pro formas, what we see is the construction costs range from anywhere from like 70% of the cost to, in cases where the pro forma doesn't work, to over 100% of the cost. So they're very significant. The challenge is, there's only two ways to make this pro forma work, right? You either increase incomes so that as buyer, I can go and I can spend more money on the house, and that will make pro formas work, or we reduce the costs, right? And what we always have to keep in mind is that development charges, being one component of the cost, the development charges are to recover the capital costs associated with development. If you don't use development charges, the money has to come from somewhere, and then it's going to fall on taxes and ratepayers. So over the last few years, regional staff have been very good at and diligent at keeping track of a list of some of the issues that have come up and some complaints that have come to council. And so it's one of the things we're going to be reviewing as part of this bylaw process. And this is nothing new. This happens all the time when municipalities pass a bylaw, especially when the housing market softens. Then there's a lot more challenges to the development charges. And so, there's the definition of gross floor area. So what are we defining as the payable or the chargeable area? The definition of manufacturing and industrial, how does that get categorized? The application of charges to parking garages for different types of development, conversion of rental apartments to condos, right? Rental development, they get a discount, they get to pay installments. But what if there's a rental building that 2 years after their rental, they decide to sell it and convert it to condos? How do we deal with that? So we'll deal with that. And then generally aligning where possible with the local area municipalities, right? So we're going to have a number of meetings with the local area municipalities. In previous year rounds of the DC study, we've met with treasurers, planners, building officials to try to align the policies as much as possible, right? With a number of local municipalities, there's always a little bit of variation, but where possible to align things to make things a bit easier. So in terms of the background study process, where we are at, so we have been working with staff. One of the things, and we're going to bring this, to council for the consultation and your consideration, is a best practices policy review. So a lot of those complaints that have occurred over the last few years, we're going to start to look at what other municipalities do and start to look at it from a best practice perspective compared to the local municipalities, and then as well compared to other regional and single-tier municipalities. We'll talk about some of the policy matters as well in there in terms of the calculations, benefit to existing, all of those things. We'll put that in the best practices review. we've been working with staff, having meetings with the different department areas to gather the information to prepare the background study. So to start to prepare the capital needs and look at the historical level of service. So we've been working on that. And then there's the ongoing water, wastewater master servicing plan and the transportation master plan, which when that information is available, we'll be able to pull that information into the calculations to have a full set of calculations. And we anticipate to have those calculations probably later in the fall for all the other services except water, wastewater, roads, and then maybe draft calculations for those services shortly thereafter. We will be establishing kind of the meeting schedule with the interested parties, so the local municipalities, the home builders associations, to start to bring forward information as we have it prepared. And then we're anticipating to have the final report posted on the website probably in March of 2027. And then the public meeting would be probably April to May, and then the anticipated bylaw passage as early as June. And that's in advance of the bylaw expiry in August. I believe it's August. So lastly, I just want to touch on the development charge reduction program. So I'm sure you're all aware of this. The program came out June 1st, and the applications were due June 19th, very quickly. But I know municipalities across the province worked diligently, and I know regional staff did as well, to put together a package of information. And so the intent of this funding is really to reduce development charges, right? It's right in the name, DC reduction program. But it's also intended, based on how they've set this up, to fund housing enabling infrastructure and hopefully kickstart development, right? The idea from the province is if development charges are decreased, more of those pro formas will work, more development will happen, and then we need to build housing enabling infrastructure to accommodate those houses. As part of that, municipalities need to reduce their development charges by at least 30 to 50% to be eligible, and also fund 10% of your portion. And it's generally tied to the amount of relief you're providing. So if you're going to reduce your development charges by 50% and you have 100 homes being developed, and each of them, let's say they save $10,000, I'm just making up numbers, they each of them save $10,000, you multiply the amount of money that they saved, and that's generally what your grant's tied to, right? And so it really is dependent on how much development happens, and then how much, which would relate to how much money you're going to get through the grant program. And so, you know, there's a number of municipalities that have ongoing development charge background study processes, working right now with Waterloo Region, Halton Region, and a number of other municipalities who are going through this process. The application doesn't need to impact the DC study process. And so we can continue on with the work because the reductions only apply to the residential side. So if we wanted to go through, calculate what the true cost of growth is through the development charge background study, then you can pass the bylaw. And so that when the, and I'll show you a graph on the, or a schematic on the next slide, but essentially then once you pass the bylaw, the new non-residential rate will continue, and in your existing reduced rate for residential will continue through the program until the program's done, and then your residential rate will automatically update. There's some different approaches we can take. We could extend the background study and then update the work that we're doing closer to when the bylaw, we can extend the bylaw so that we can update the calculations closer to when the bylaw expires. But I think what we're working on with staff is trying to understand what the implications are. We're going to see what the province comes back with in August to see if funding was awarded, and then provide some recommendations to council on how we should move forward. And so this is really just a schematic and timeline of kind of how this would work. So if you were to receive the funding, the discounted residential rates would continue all the way till March 2029. The non-residential rates would continue on, and if you pass a bylaw, the new rates would kick in when that new bylaw takes effect, and those would be in effect. And then on the residential side, the new residential rates we calculate as part of the bylaw would take effect once the DCRP is complete. So I know that was a lot of information, so I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, please make sure that I'm aware. Before we start, being a counselor sitting around the horseshoe, some counselors go out of their way to make political statements. This is to for questions only to the presenter, not to staff, just to the presenter on this presentation. And if you go outside that realm, I'm going to call you out of order. So the first speaker is Tom Insina, please.
Question. I do have a question. I will make sure the question mark is right at the end. When the province is looking at reductions in DCs, the money's got to come from somewhere. And it's going to have a direct impact on whether lower tier or upper tier do, because the reliance on DCs. Is that being taken into consideration, or how is that going to work? Because we have so many things here at the region that are contingent on DC funding. So if we're going to collect less, is there another way that can be supplemented, do you think?
So through the chair, just to clarify, are you referring to the development charge reduction program or just DCs being reduced in general?
Well, it actually both, because they're both are going to have a huge impact on municipalities, whether it's this or other municipalities.
Yeah, so through the chair, so the development charge reduction program, the intent of it is to cover 90% of the loss, right? The way I always think about it is the province has been saying to municipalities, reduce development charges, and municipalities said, well, we can't afford it because we need to fund the infrastructure. So they said, tell you what, we'll pay 90% of that, then you pay 10%. So in that vein, the intent for the development charge reduction program is that they're going to cover 90% of the loss, right? You'll cover 10%. Generally, on the reductions in development charges, how do you pay for it? You have to pay for it somehow, and it's through taxes if it's tax-supported service, or rates if it's water, wastewater. There's really, when I go back to that municipal financial impact diagram, again, the money has to come from somewhere. If you're going to accommodate that growth by building the infrastructure, you have to pay for it. If you can't pay for it with development charges, you pay for it with taxes or rates.
Okay. And one more, Chair, through you. You touched on infrastructure that's already that's already in place. Let's just say a major trunk is already there. If another subdivision is built off of that, it's reduced. Their DCs are reduced because the infrastructure is already there. The main line is already there. Is that what I'm hearing?
So through the chair, no, their development charges wouldn't be reduced if the infrastructure is there. They still, generally when we do the water, wastewater rate calculations, it's on the serviced area basis. So the entire service area, we take the total growth, we take the total costs, we divide it by the total growth, and then they all pay development charges.
Okay, even though the pipes and everything there are there already.
That's correct.
Okay,
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councilor Olson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering about the life cycle costs. Life cycle costs, to me, are quite a bit more substantial than the actual capital cost of acquisition. How are they to be collected from developers? I misunderstood what you were saying about that, or didn't understand that.
Yeah, so through the chair, the life cycle costs are not collected from the developers. It's just what you would do is you would incorporate that into your budgets. So into your tax supported or your rate supported budgets.
Okay, thank you. I did misunderstand that, so thank you. And the other one is on the chart that you show the comparative numbers by municipality. Is it safe to assume that from this chart that it looks to me from the chosen municipalities here, that it looks like to me that the regional component is among the lowest in Niagara region? Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, so through the chair, the regional component compared to the other regions on the graph, yeah, compared to the other regions for sure.
Yeah, so it appears that we're the lowest of all the selected ones, and I don't imagine you selected everybody. You know, you didn't have room for everybody, so, you know, I guess that's reassuring to an extent. Is there any, through your chair, is there any option for delaying services that might not be immediately needed by somebody, let's say the capital cost of a fire hall that we won't have for 3 years or something like that? Is there a way to give relief to the developers for that? That type of thing by deferring those charges?
Yeah, so through the chair, so theoretically, if you were to say, well, we're just going to move that fire station out of the capital costs, and we're not going to do it within our time horizon, the challenge with that is if that development needs that fire station, they should still be allocated towards that cost. And so if you then push it out and they're still benefiting, that now becomes a benefit to the existing community that gets paid for with taxes.
Okay. Thank you. And through you, Chair, a question, one of our largest costs as a region is our policing costs. Is there any way of that's being deferred or postponed or anything to the developers?
So through the chair, I can't speak to the specific projects about if things are being delayed or not. I know that when we start to put together the listing of the capital projects, then we'll be able to come back with staff and talk about what the plans are.
Okay. And through you, Chair, I had a question about the capital costs themselves. You make the statement quite correctly, I believe, at the time, that a lot of the capital costs we're looking at have been affected by COVID. More recently, I think you'll find that the market has become more competitive and the costs have come down. How will that be reflected in the development charges?
Yeah, so through the chair, that's exactly right. Some of what we've seen is that kind of spike up to 2022, 2023, 2024, and then they're starting to come back down a little bit now with the competition. So when we undertake the calculations, we'll be utilizing the most recent unit costs, so from 2026. So if the costs have come down, then it will be reflected because we're going to use the most recent replacement costs or anticipated capital costs using today's dollars.
Okay, thank you. And through you, Chair, my final question is, you mentioned that the reserve funds allocation of 60%. How does that work now? Is it a deferred charge or?
Yeah, so through the chair, what happens now is we take the balance at the beginning of the year. So let's say you have $5 million sitting in your development charge reserve fund for roads. What needs to happen is with the annual treasurer statement, we need to say, okay, well, let's take 60% of that 5 million. Okay, so let's take 300,000. Let's say, how are we going to allocate that to, 3 million, too many zeros. And how are we going to, I'm good at math, I promise. And how are we going to allocate that to future projects? So we'd probably take a look at the list of projects in our DC background study and say, okay, well, we have this money. We're going to spend this 3 million on this project, maybe this project and this project. So we just need to identify what projects we anticipate spending the money on. And then every year, the treasurer statement gets updated. If you didn't spend the money, you just explain why. Maybe you change from this project to that project, just to identify how we're using the money.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your answers. I appreciate them.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Councillor Kaiser.
Thank you, Acting Chair. Through you to the presenter, thank you so much. I have questions on 2 slides. Could we maybe go to 15? Would that be okay?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm not sure, there we go. Okay. I'm not sure I exactly understand the math and the message here. So it's identifying an emerging issue with DCs, and then it says that it's typically between 6 and 8%, but then I see from what you brought me that they are sitting between 6 and 8%. So I'm not understanding the message that it's an emerging issue, and I'm not really sure about those columns, like if those are different years, when it says Prudham's Landing, 948,800, and then 1.2 million. If you could just expand on that, that would be great.
Yeah, so through the chair, so the columns are just, there's a range, so, you can have a 25-foot lot or a 50-foot lot, and they'll change. So that's all that is. But the emerging issue kind of discussion is that development charges are too high, right? Development charges are too high, so we can't build. And so what I'm just trying to present here is that we have to take into account what we need development charges for. Development charges are to recover the capital costs associated with growth. And if we actually look at the percentage of the sales price, what we see is that it actually has been trending in the same range that it has been historically. So when we say development charges are too high, stifling growth, perhaps there's some other reasons that are impacting the issue. And that's where I led into this slide, which is more of one of the big issues is incomes have not increased with construction costs. So all the costs go up, but incomes have not gone up. So then people can't afford to purchase the houses at the prices that the developers need to sell them at to make a profit. So.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. If we could go back to slide 15. So I appreciate that, and I now understand sort of the range of housing costs now as opposed to years. So if DCs have traditionally been in the range of 6.8%, so that's been a sort of a trend for a number of years?
Yeah, through the chair, that just looking back, over the 20 years, that they're generally in that range, yeah.
Okay, so I'm just curious of where the narrative is that they're too high. Like, I'm just not connecting the dots if it's traditionally been 6 to 8% and they're still at that range. So I'm just not connecting those dots.
Well, yeah, so through the chair, I think it's because, and just, my perspective of where the development community is coming from, is that when we look at the pro forma and we say, well, we need to build for this cost so we can sell our units, they start looking at all the components of that. And when we take a look at the big survey and we say, well, and more so if we're in the GTA, that's where more of this came from, right? If I'm spending over $100,000 or $150,000 or $180,000 for a single detached unit just on development charges, then okay, well that easily looks like we can't build a house because of development charges. But that's why I wanted to put it in context for the region and where your development charges are sitting, because it is different than, let's say, the GTA or generally the Greater Golden Horseshoe.
Okay, thank you, through Chair. And is there a time in history over the last 30 years that it's been lower than 6 to 8%? Like, what is considered the appropriate percentage? If you're saying they're too high, there must be a benchmark, or if someone is. I'm just wondering over the years if there's been any sort of traditional pro forma calculation that over the last 30 years, on average, they've been 5%. Like, where are we getting this number from?
Yeah, so through the chair, I don't think there's a magic number just because of all those other components that go into the cost. And the revenues, right? The incomes haven't changed. So it's hard to say a specific number, but I would guess if we took a look at the numbers, let's say just post-COVID, when all the housing market went up and up and up, development charges didn't rise at that rate during that period. So I would say if we looked at it probably around that time, we would see a much lower percentage relative to what we see today.
Thank you, through you. So essentially, you're saying that the development charges stayed static, so to speak, but then the percentage went down because of the high cost of housing at that time, post-COVID.
Yeah, so they've generally stayed static if we compare yours to where it was in 2020,
Right,
for sure.
okay.
But some municipalities have increased, and some haven't. So yeah, in your case, the regional DCs have stayed the same since, I guess, 2022. And so you updated yours in 2022, so just after the COVID kind of pandemic came in. But if we looked at, let's say, 2021, before you updated those rates, we would see that percentage definitely shrink. So it fluctuates over time, but that's why I said generally over the last 20 years it's been in this range. Just going to highlight the fact that other factors are compounding to make housing a challenge, and it's not necessarily just development charges.
Okay, so, and I'll finish off. So just, it would be accurate to say then that the percentage is obviously rising as markets soften, and so those were those external factors. So, but even pre-COVID, we were up and around 6 to 8%. Is that correct?
I'm not sure exactly
Okay.
the number
That's fine.
in the region, but yeah.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. And I'm not sure, through you, Chair, if this is the right question. Maybe it'll have to go to staff after. But on slide number 8, I was just noticing the notation about the exemption for attainable and affordable housing. And but we did some work last year on or this year, grants in terms of affordable, attainable housing. So do you know the relationship between this, where now it's exempt and will those grants still be applied, or do you know, or I could also ask staff afterwards if that's okay?
Yeah,
Terms
through
of
the chair, I
grants.
think that'd be a good question for staff with respect to that specific program. I know we're going to be looking at the programs through this process, just to comment on them. I was just more referring to the legislation and what the
Right.
legislation says, yeah.
Okay, so my question can be later to staff, just about how the legislation now relates to our grants that are contributing to those kinds of housing.
When
So
we have
thank
the
you very much.
presentation,
Yep. no
I'm
problem.
sure Blair would love to answer
We
that
can
question.
do that later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Councillor Easton, please.
Thank you, Acting Chair. Thank you for your presentation. On page 5, the DC overview and the eligible services. Are each of those categories applied in the same manner? So, for example, is the assignment to the library the same as the assignment to waste diversion?
Through the chair, could you clarify the same assignment?
Yeah, so if I'm applying, I'm just going to use any number, 1% to transit, is 1% also applied to library services?
So through the chair, when we calculate the charges, we're going to look at the capital needs for each of those services separately. So they could be different. And so are you referring maybe to like an exemption or reduction in the charge? Because if there was a reduction and you reduced all of the charges by 10%, then they would all reduce by 10%.
No, what I'm looking at, Mr. Chair, is an impression that people may have that we have two lists here of quite substantial services, and that we're receiving a substantial amount of money in each case, which means that we have millions of dollars sitting in the bank. I don't think that's the case. So I was looking for some explanation from you.
Yeah, so through the chair, so, each of those services are the eligible services. And so the region will only be including the regional services, and only those regional services where we have identified a growth-related need. And so one service might have a heavy growth-related need, like water and wastewater infrastructure, which have significant capital needs, whereas maybe another service like public health doesn't have as a significant significant capital need identified in the background study. And so we'd look at them all differently. So it could vary completely between the services.
Okay, well, I think that's a fair explanation. On page 14, slide 14, there's a couple of things on this slide that are kind of interesting. And down at the bottom, where the municipalities are listed, some of them have some clarifications in brackets. So Halton Hills has Greenfield in the brackets beside it, and Oakville has Built Boundary. And Hamilton actually has two totally different systems that have been calculated that are on here. So again, perception is that everybody is being presented equally, but they really aren't. It's not an intentional thing to create a conflict, but they're not the same. So what do you have to say about that? How should we interpret this?
Yeah, so through the chair, what happens is different areas will have different needs for infrastructure. And so in the example of Halton Region, where we have the built boundary versus the greenfield area, we have different capital needs to accommodate the different areas. And so we can get a difference in development charges required for each of those areas based on those capital needs. And what tends to happen too is municipalities that are, let's say, further away from the lake, for example, there's a lot more infrastructure required to get there. And so we're going to see potentially higher development charges in those municipalities because they're further away from the lake, that we need to build a longer pipe and more roads to access that development. And so it really is just about the amount of cost required to accommodate the development in those different areas.
Yes, I think that's a very good clarification. And by the way, when you're having that conversation again, and you're talking about the difference in costs, the costs of managing surface water aren't exactly small either. So there's quite a bit to be considered here. So I just want to make sure that nobody is looking at this in a simplistic manner. So I'd like to talk to you about some of the pressures that are being brought to bear and some of the things that are being said about how rich, cash-rich municipalities are, and that includes the region. So could we just talk briefly about what kind of oversight goes into the process so that people that are watching this understand that there are many, many checks and balances? Could you speak to that, please?
Of course. So through the chair, so when we work through preparing the development charge background study analysis, we work with staff to identify what the anticipated capital needs are. A lot of times that comes from master plans, the transportation master plan, water, wastewater servicing master plan, which within those own studies have public consultation with the development community to develop those capital needs. Then we're going to take those needs, we're going to put them in the background study, and then we're also going to have a consultation. We're going to bring forward the information, the calculations to the development community, to local interested parties. We're going to have this document put on the website. We have a public meeting where anyone from the public or development community can come make representation, challenge the calculations in the study. Then once we pass the bylaw, then the developers or anyone has 40 days to appeal the bylaw and bring that to the Ontario Land Tribunal to challenge the calculations. And so by the time we get to actually publishing the background study, the calculations have been vetted not just by regional staff, consultants such as myself and some other consultants, but also generally we've consulted with the development community and got their feedback and input as well. So by the time we pass the bylaw, hopefully we've already dealt with a lot of those issues and engaged with a number of parties to make sure that the calculations are accurate.
Great, that's very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Bateman, please.
Thank you, Acting Chair. Sorry about the background noise here. Can you go to slide 7, please? So my question through you, Chair, is you mentioned the profits for the developers, and I can certainly appreciate after being here for almost 4 years how much there is in developing and all of that sort of thing. And I'm wondering, how do we know about the developers' profit? And I've asked our staff this before, but we don't seem to have any audit in place yet. We're saying we need all these things for them to have a profit or increase their profit. So what guarantee do taxpayers have that we are doing our due diligence?
Yeah, so through the chair, we don't have the ability to gather information on developers' profits. It's private companies. They don't have to share that information. And it also doesn't get worked into the development charge calculation, right? So what we're trying to identify through the calculation is what are those capital needs required to accommodate the growth, divided by the growth, so we can allocate those costs equitably amongst the developers or amongst the development so that we know what the true cost of development is. Yes, there's requests to reduce the charges in light of issues with pro formas and developer profit, but that's not our role. That's not my role as the consultant to speak on that, and it's up to them to share that information.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, do you recommend that our 12 municipalities kind of agree on a DC plan and come to kind of a consensus? And the reason I'm saying that is because at this council we've sometimes had debates about what we're charging and how we're charging, and I can appreciate where the mayors sit there, at both tables. And since we're just going to have mayors on our council next year, is that something that you would recommend that we take on?
Through the chair, my role in this is to recommend what the charges could be as per the legislation, and some considerations of that. I'll leave the agreements to the politicians.
Thank you, Chair. No other questions.
Thank you. Councillor Villela?
Through you, Mr. Chair, but I think that the speaker just kind of nailed me to the whatever right there. I was going to ask if in the review we would be, and this is just to expand a little bit on Councillor Bateman, would we be looking at an alignment between the region and the municipalities? So there are certain grants that are applicable only to the municipalities, and I think the DCRP is one of them. And I can understand why, if the government is coughing up 90% of it, that's fair to say they're not doing the same for the region. But would it be worthy to look at a possible alignment based on individual municipalities between the region? To further explain myself just as best as I can on this one, there are certain grants that are applicable, for example, to construction, commercial properties, downtown, commercial, residential, especially in the downtown cores of municipalities, that are applicable to grants through the municipality. But when we go to the region, or when the developer goes to the region, they may not be applicable. So that leads me to, and I'll end with this and await your response, but it goes back to the age-old question, which you probably won't answer or may not want to answer, but about DC fees themselves. Do they protect, existing taxpayers from subsidizing growth, or do they make housing more expensive and discourage investment? So I'm hoping in the review that we'll be trying to align the region with the municipalities for a smoother transition and a smoother growth process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, through the chair. So, as part of this process, we do have a number of engagement sessions lined up with, which we will be booking shortly once we have some policy information to review. But we will be looking at where we can align policies with the local area municipalities. We'll do so. And we've done this in the 2017, the 2022 background study process. We meet with the local treasurers, the planners, the building officials, and we try to streamline, try to align policies. With the number of municipalities in the region, there's a number of different policies and approaches for certain things that might work for your specific municipality, but that we need to figure out from a regional perspective what makes sense. The timing of the index was something that's relatively easy to align. Some of the definitions where we can align is very helpful. And so we'll be looking to do that through this process as much as possible.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Foster.
Yes, thank you, Chair Height. It's interesting, your last three speakers, including myself now, are all kind of focusing in on the same area. As you did mention, general alignment with the local area municipalities going into play. So when we're building a comprehensive DC plan for the region itself, is there any methodologies to be a bit flexible? And what I mean by that is that, let's say Niagara Falls has this really terrific idea that they're doing for their municipality when it comes to DCs, but the other 11 say, no, that's crazy. We want nothing to do with that. Are there any methodologies within this for us to have sort of almost municipal exemptions or municipal pieces, or do we have to look at this as a whole?
So through the chair, if we're doing it through the development charges bylaw, any exemptions or reductions, generally the intent is that we're treating everyone equitably. Now, I will say there is one case where I worked with an upper tier municipality that they did institute area-specific exemptions by municipality to align with the local municipalities. That being said, you've taken most of your exemptions out of the bylaw and provided them through a grant program, which is a much more flexible way in which you can impose these kind of exemptions. You can put limitations on them. There's a number of parameters you can implement, and you can consider them on a case-by-case basis, which you cannot do if it's in a development charge bylaw. So I think the way that you've gone is the correct way to do it. So I would say if you're going to look at any area-specific type grants or exemptions, that you do it through the grant program, consider it as a region, and then fund it through the grant program.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So my second comment, or I guess question, because I don't want to get myself into trouble with the chair, is concerning your comment about best practices. You know, the reality is that no one seems to like DCs. Developers don't like it. We like it because, you know, well, it gives us a source of income. But best practices is kind of a funny word. Is there opportunities to develop better practices going through this? I mean, you know, is it possible for us to sort of open this thing up and say, look, the general unhappiness with the way DCs work right now is because of X, Y, and Z. So give us an opportunity to perhaps maybe be leading edge on this as opposed to, you know, trying to get answers from other municipalities.
Yeah, so through the chair, I mean, you know, the challenge with with development charges is that there's legislation that's fairly rigid in how we apply these things, and so I wouldn't, you know, in terms of best practices or better practices, there's only so much we can do with the revenue tool that we're given the legislative restrictions. Ontario is the most restrictive legislation when it comes to these types of charges. More restrictive than any other province. And so we are kind of limited to what we're allowed to do through the Development Charges Act. That being said, if there is some creative way in which we can look at the calculations or, you know, approach a policy, definitely open to that and opening to considering that with legal to ensure that we're in alignment with the legislation.
Yeah, thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair. I may have missed this or I misread it or whatever the case may be. So if the province is in building a facility within Niagara, there's no TCs involved with it?
So through the chair, if it's a Crown corporation, then no, there's no DCs. If it's a provincial arm's length, not a Crown corporation, then there most likely would be development charges applied.
So my question on that, I don't know the answer. You'll probably have it. Like things like hospitals, how do they fit into this type of a thing?
Yeah. So through the chair, hospitals are that magical gray area in the legislation where because it's not a Crown corporation and it's arm's length, that they can be charged, and they typically are charged. A number of municipalities have exemptions specifically for hospitals so that they don't charge them. So typically they would be charged under the legislation.
Okay, thank you. Just one last thing. So, and you don't have to flip to the slide, but all the areas that we actually get development charges from, and I you know, looking at this actually, it's important for us to make sure we have, you know, good DCs in place for what it is that we're trying to do. But it seems the lower tier municipalities have an awful lot of other things that come into play separate and aside, right? So how much flexibility do the lower tier municipalities, and I think Councillor Easton was kind of getting at it, what do the lower tier municipalities, do they have any flexibility with those? I think not, but you know, as a, for instance, let's talk about the library piece of the puzzle again. Like, you know, is it something that must be spent on libraries? Is it a suggestion that it can be spent? Just so everybody's clear on where this is.
Yeah. So through the chair, you do not have to have a development charge bylaw, and you do not have to impose development charges for any service. That being said, if you don't have development charges for library services, you're funding all of it with taxes, tax-supported budget. And so there's no requirement to fund all of it or a portion of it from development charges, but you have the ability to impose a bylaw to recover the costs from growth.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor.
Oh, microphone's on. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The 10% that I was reading in the DC reduction program is going to come out of our budget. So yes, the province is trying to help spur on development, but this is going to cost the general public here in town, or in the region. So that's gonna hurt us, but I understand what they're doing and I agree with it, and I think it's a good idea. The thing is, it started me down a rabbit hole. I was first gonna say, is there a way that when a development comes in, and we'll just say a 100-acre development with, I don't know, 100 homes, 1,000 homes in it or whatever, are we allowed to, as the region, instead of charging those development charges to the developer, are we allowed to put a levy on the taxes of those homes when they are built, so that we could spread out that charge over, say, a 10-year period and still get our money to do what's going on? Does that make sense? I'm just trying to see how we could help spur on development by spreading it out. I mean, you know, in this world, you see all these ads, finance this TV, finance and whatever else. So it would be kind of like financing the development charges. Is that a possibility? I don't know if you can answer that or our staff. Is that possible?
Yeah, so through the chair, you can have area rating for taxes. So you can area rate taxes. The challenge would be from an administrative perspective, it would be so challenging to administer that because you think you have let's say you have that development move forward and you impose the tax on them. They're probably not going to build that development out in year one. Correct. So then do you charge, some of the units now, and then do you charge some of the units a higher tax rate and some of the units a higher tax rate? And then administratively, you carry that tax rate for, let's say you do it over 10 years, and then that drops off. And then you have development over here that started in year 5, and you have different tax rates. So you're going to have, in let's say 10, 15-year period, you're going to have all these different special tax rates for all these special areas, which would create a significant administrative burden.
Okay, through you, Mr. Chair. That's the case on a residential end. What about an industrial development? So, we're fortunate enough to have that battery separator plant going on, and there's huge infrastructure costs there. I mean, I'm sure they would have rather paid, instead of having to pay for it up front, would have loved to stretch it out over 10 years. Again, is that something we could do next time something like that comes up?
Yeah, so through the chair, if you have specific developments, let's say that would be interested in that, you have the ability to defer development charges. So there's a section 27 of the legislation says you can defer the charges. So you can set up an installment plan or a payment plan for specific developments. That is something you can do. And I think as part of this process, we're actually going to be looking at front-ending policy for deferrals or early payment and credits to bring forward to council to consider. So, that's something you could do for certain developments, let's say industrial developments, if you wanted to.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Before I get to second question, are there any other individuals here that would like to ask questions to the presenter, other than me? Well, Councillor Jordan, go ahead.
Thank you, through the chair. Maybe we can kind of address the elephant in the room, because I don't think the development charges matter that much. I think it's the fact that people don't want to pay right now. People aren't buying homes right now, and our development charges aren't over the board. I really think in Grimsby we have 4,000 units already approved, not being developed. And I think our development charges aren't out of line, and I really think that it's the economy right now. What do you think?
Through the chair, way to make that a question. Yeah, I agree. I think, and that's where when I'm talking about the emerging issues about development charges being too high, especially within the region, what we see is they're not relative to where they've been historically. It's a lot of those other pressures they're seeing. Incomes aren't going up, incomes aren't increasing, so people can't pay more for the houses. Construction costs increase, and with the construction costs increase, the cost is higher. So then what we're seeing is a misalignment in those pro formas. The costs are too high for the incomes or for the market price of these homes, and so they don't get built.
Any other wisdom from Counselor Jordan? Go ahead, Counselor Bateman.
Thank you, Chair. I forgot my question when I previously, so thank you for giving me another chance. You had mentioned through you, Chair, that 90% of the DCs would be charged to the provincial government. Is that correct?
Through the chair, are you referring to the development charge reduction program?
Yes.
Yeah, so through the chair, the development charge reduction program is a joint program between the federal government and the provincial government. And so they're jointly funding 90% of the reduction that you're providing to the developers.
Thank you. My question, and again, I've only been this for one term, but quite often, I won't say quite often, we do see promises from the government and they come in many shapes and forms. And how are we guaranteed that what we're reducing will get paid for by those governments? Is it a grant process that we have to, or do we just say this is what we've reduced it by and this is what the shortfall is? Can you provide some insight into that?
Yeah, so through the chair, the development charge reduction program is based on the amount of DC relief you're going to provide. And so as part of the application, region staff would have identified the anticipated amount of development that would occur, the amount of development charge reduction that development would receive, and that will generally say how much you could get in funding. Now, I know there's some adjustments to that; it's not exact, but what we will know more in August. If the region's successful, the region will look at reviewing a TPA, a transfer payment agreement, with the province and the feds, and within that agreement, we'll have more information on as to whether or not that amount is guaranteed, whether there's a clawback, as they've identified there might be. So all of that would get worked out in the actual agreement.
Thank you. So I just want to be sure that we're not agreeing to do something without having all of the information through you, Chair. I don't know if that's something that you, Chair, could reply to based upon, I know we're not addressing staff right now, but maybe we could put a pin in that and have staff address it following this presentation.
Sure, I'm interested in it as well. That was one of my questions later. Counselor Easton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted a little update on the education piece. I see that there's a new part in here for universities. Did I understand that colleges were already exempt?
Yeah, so through the chair, colleges are exempt if they're a Crown corporation. So, and it's a little bit convoluted. We had to look at the Interpretation Act, which follows that essentially a Crown corporation is not charged a charge unless that the respective act actually says that you're going to impose a charge on them. So because the Development Charges Act doesn't say it applies to Crown corporations, we don't impose a development charge to Crown corporations. Niagara College, for example, is listed as a Crown corporation under the Colleges and Training Act. I think that's what it's called.
Okay, and what about independent schools?
Through the chair, independent schools, if they're not Crown corporations, let's say they're a private school, they would be charged development charges.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Counselor Valla.
Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair, my question was answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Counselor Kaiser.
Thank you, Acting Chair. Through you, could we just actually go to slide 18? I had a question in regards to the study itself. Thank you so much. So I just wondered within this process and this review policy and interviews, et cetera, will there be sort of included in the report and the study back consideration of the impacts of any changes on taxpayers and also our reserve funds? Because last few budgets I've looked, we're not sitting on major capital reserves. But sorry, that was a little side note. But if I could ask if that will be part of the study report back to us, to Regional Council.
Yeah, so through the chair, as part of the background study process, what we need to identify is the long-term operating implications of adding these capital projects and the life cycle costs related to those projects. So there will be an appendix that talks about that. It won't be specific to each service and the potential impact on the reserves. It's more of for each service, what's the long-term operating and life cycle implications of the capital works.
Of any changes that would be made potentially? Sorry, through you, Chair.
To the chair, of the additional capital projects on the list, what are the additional operating costs and capital life cycle costs arising from those works?
Okay, sorry, Chair, just make sure I understand. So we're talking about the meetings with interested parties to understand their concerns, let's say of application of charges to parking garages. And let's say perhaps the study says, we think we should not have charges to parking garages. Will we then know what the financial impact is on our capital reserves and on potentially our taxpayers?
Right. So through the chair, yeah. So for some of if there were some changes, we would try to quantify what that is. Some of the things would be harder to quantify, right? Like, for example, we're looking at, let's say, growth from 2027 to 2051, right? How much of that growth is going to have parking garages? We could estimate. We could try to estimate. It would be a high-level estimate, but we could try to put together some amounts. And as part of the review of the incentives and those changes, we're going to be looking at trying to quantify those.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Now it's my turn. On graph number 5, the DC overview, where you've included Toronto-York subway extension, which has nothing to do with us, I'm assuming that's on the list, so we could look at GO stations as an example in Niagara and the expansions that we're looking at to include that in the DC. Is that why that's there?
Well, that's there because it's listed specifically in the legislation. These are just the services. It would fall under transit. GO Transit would either fall under transit. We could have a special charge for GO Transit. Or there is a new piece of legislation called the GO Transit Station Funding Act that could be potentially utilized for GO station infrastructure. There's some different rules, but there's 2 authorities generally that we could use.
Okay. You stated in the presentation the bylaw will be from 5 to a 10-year span now. So we're going to have you look at the crystal ball of Niagara for a 10-year span, understanding where development's probably going, and then anticipate that new growth and build that into the new study.
Well, actually, I'll be looking at a crystal ball till 2051, so even further than that. But the life of the bylaw is just 10 years now instead of 5. And so all that means is you could leave the bylaw and you don't have to update it for 10 years. You could update it before 10 years. Let's say in 5 years or 6 years, you update the transportation and water wastewater master servicing plans. You have new costs. They're very different than what they were before. You can update the development charge background study. You just can't wait more than 10 years.
So 5 years or 10.
10 or less. So you can actually add if you wanted, let's say you wanted the bylaw to expire before 10 years, you could write that into the bylaw if you wanted to.
Okay. Last question I have, I think in one of the pages you're suggesting 30 to 50% being waived, the fee. Some cities, some local municipalities might be 30, some might be 50. And then what would the region be? 30, depending on that municipality that's 30, and 50 for the communities that are 50?
So I think the region has submitted an application, and that might be a better question for staff in the next item or now, but the region has submitted an application based on a number that would apply region-wide.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. And since there are no other questions, we'll go to item CSC 16-2026. I'm looking for a mover and a seconder for that. Councillor Foster and Councillor Morocco. Any questions on that? I see Councillor Olson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. My question is to do with item 7.3.4, which is the exceptions. And the exceptions that are described here include buildings and structures owned and used by municipality, local board, or Board of Education. And my question is with respect to local board. Does that include airports?
Can staff answer that one? Director Chan?
Through the chair, Councillor, would you mind repeating the question? Is it related to the item on the screen, or is a different
No, this
item on
is,
the agenda?
this is, in fact, I believe it's page 7-4, and it makes reference to 7.3 exemption, full or partial. And it says statutory exemptions, buildings or structures owned by or used for the purpose of any municipality, local board, or Board of Education. And my first question around local boards is, does that include airports? Which I believe is operated by local boards or commissions.
Councillor Chan? Sorry. Director, Associate Director Chan? Can you answer that?
Oh, yes. Through the chair, I believe Councillor is referring to the Niagara Airport, District Airport in the region of Niagara, which has their own board, and then they are funded jointly by municipalities. So I would think that they are considered a local board, so their proposed developments would be exempt from development charges at the region.
Okay, I was actually referring to the two airports we have, and they're both, one is the Central Airport and Niagara Airport, I guess it's called. My second question, Chair, if I may, is local boards, does that include municipal service corporations?
Who wants to answer that? Who would you like? Associate Director Chan again, I guess. Or sorry, go ahead.
So, Lucy, if it's okay, Associate Director, we have the definition of local board from the background study, and it does include municipal service board.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the
Did you-
answer there.
Oh, he didn't hear you.
So through the chair, it does include, by definition, in the DC background study, a municipal service board.
Okay. And perhaps a third question, if this was a privatized entity for water and wastewater, would we get development charges for that?
If it's not public, you're talking a privately run? Privately?
That's correct, yes.
So through the chair, private entities would not be considered a local board.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Just theoretical questions for me. Thank you.
That should be posed for Port Colborne. Any other questions? Then if everyone would vote on this report, please, to receive. And that's passed. Any other business tonight? You vote? I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. Any other business tonight from council? The next meeting has not been determined, the date. I have Councillor Bateman's hands up. Go ahead, Councillor Bateman.
Sorry, Chair. Are we going to have an opportunity to address this with staff, to answer any questions directly about this with staff? When will that be?
I think we could have asked when we had CSC up to ask staff any questions specifically, but because we're past that, if you put it in writing, I'm sure they'll give you an answer within a day or so, whatever you need answered.
Thank you. So, sorry, I had thought that we were kind of asking staff questions and then it was going to be an opportunity after, and I appreciate that I've missed it. So would this be for planning and economic development? If we wanted to ask
Corporate services,
ask
probably.
questions publicly? Corporate services, is that correct?
That would be the one.
Okay. All right, thanks so much, Chair.
The only announcement I'd have is if anyone's interested in the position of chair, the public appointment will be sometime in October, but the deadline for applications is Monday, July 13th at 11:59 PM. So if anyone's interested in applying to be permanent chair for the next term, they have until that date to make their application. The reason I brought that up is I saw someone question staff where that information was, and I thought I should just make everyone aware of it. Thank you. Meeting adjourned. Thank you for attending tonight, and we'll see you sooner or later at committee or at council.